Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Abilene, Texas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1883 in the small but growing town of Abilene, Texas. The railroad had brought prosperity and new residents to what was once merely a stop on the Texas and Pacific Railway. Among these newcomers was the Brown family, who arrived on a particularly dusty April morning. Thomas Brown, a man in his mid-40s with a stern countenance and watchful eyes, his wife Eleanor, a woman whose pale complexion suggested she rarely ventured into the harsh Texas sun, and Thomas's brother William Brown, a bachelor whose quiet demeanor drew little attention. The family purchased a two-story house at the edge of town, about a mile north of the railroad station, on what was then called Pine Street. The Browns arrived during what local newspapers described as an unseasonably warm spring, with temperatures climbing well above normal for April in central Texas. The Abilene Weekly Gazette mentioned the stifling conditions that had settled over the region, noting that many residents found it difficult to sleep in the oppressive heat. It was against this backdrop of climatic discomfort that the Browns took possession of their new home, arriving in a rented carriage loaded with trunks and crates, but curiously few personal items or furniture, according to witnesses. What makes this case particularly unsettling is not what was known about the Browns, but rather what was never discovered. According to town records filed at the Abilene County Courthouse, the Browns came from somewhere in Pennsylvania, though the exact location was inconsistently recorded in different documents. Thomas claimed to be a businessman looking for opportunities in the growing Texas economy, while William was introduced as a writer working on historical accounts of frontier expansion. When questioned more specifically about their background by curious neighbors, the Browns offered vague responses that somehow discouraged further inquiry. Martha Johnson noted in her journal, "Mrs. Brown mentioned a town in Pennsylvania that I'm familiar with, yet when I expressed my delight and asked which church they had attended there, she looked at her husband as if seeking permission to answer." Mr. Brown smoothly interjected that they had lived somewhat outside the town proper and had kept largely to themselves. Something in his tone made it clear that further questions would not be welcome. The house they purchased had previously belonged to the Miller family, who had suddenly departed for California after living there for nearly 8 years. Local rumors suggested the Millers left due to financial troubles, though no formal records confirm this. The house stood somewhat apart from others, with a small grove of mesquite trees separating it from the nearest neighbor, the Johnsons, who lived about a quarter mile down the road. A detail often overlooked in accounts of the Brown case is that the Miller family's departure had itself been somewhat mysterious. Harold Miller, a successful merchant who had served briefly on the town council, had given no indication of financial difficulty prior to the family's abrupt relocation. Indeed, town records show that Miller had recently invested in expanding his business interests. The sale of the house to the Browns was handled through an intermediary, and no direct communication between the Millers and Browns was ever documented. A yellowed newspaper clipping from the Abilene Weekly Gazette, dated March 15, 1883, briefly mentioned the sale. The former Miller property on Pine Street has been acquired by Mr. Thomas Brown and family, recently arrived from the East. Mr. Brown expressed his satisfaction with the property and his eagerness to establish himself in our community. The article contains no photograph, only this sparse announcement that would later take on a more ominous significance. Architectural records from the county archive indicate that the Miller house had been constructed in 1871, one of the first substantial residences built after Abilene's founding. The original plans show a conventional two-story structure with 4 bedrooms, a parlor, dining room, kitchen, and a small study. A notable feature was the root cellar, unusually large for homes of that period and region, extending well beyond the footprint of the house itself. The builder, Conrad Schmidt, was known for incorporating distinctive features in his designs, though the Miller House was considered one of his more conventional works. For the first months after their arrival, the Browns kept to themselves in a way that wasn't entirely unusual for newcomers, but nonetheless drew quiet notice from longtime residents. Thomas would be seen in town conducting business, primarily at the bank and occasionally at the general store. Eleanor rarely appeared in public, and when she did, witnesses described her as wearing unusually formal attire for the Texas heat and speaking very little. William was occasionally spotted walking alone at dusk along the periphery of their property, notebook in hand, seemingly documenting something only he could perceive. The Browns' interactions with townspeople were minimal and strictly practical. Thomas established an account at the First National Bank of Abilene, made purchases at Parker's General Store, and occasionally visited the town's small library. According to the recollections of Herbert Parker, owner of the General Store, recorded in a 1932 oral history project, Mr. Brown always paid in cash, always knew exactly what he wanted, and never lingered to chat like most customers. He'd ask after specific items, unusual things sometimes like specialized tools or chemicals for what he called household improvements, and if we didn't have them, he'd simply nod and leave without disappointment. Never saw him smile, not once in all the months he came to my store. Parker's records, preserved by his family and later donated to the Abilene Historical Society, show that among Thomas Brown's purchases were unusual quantities of salt, copper wire, glass containers of various sizes, and chemicals typically used for photographic development, though no camera equipment was ever purchased. When questioned about these purchases by Parker, Brown reportedly explained that he was conducting experiments of a scientific nature, though he declined to elaborate on their specific purpose. What we know about the family comes primarily from the journal of Martha Johnson, wife of Samuel Johnson, who lived down the road. Her writings, discovered in 1962 during a renovation of the old Johnson homestead, provide the most consistent account of the Browns during their time in Abilene. "There is something peculiar about our new neighbors," Martha wrote in May of 1883. "Mr. Brown is courteous when encountered, but never invites conversation. Mrs. Brown has visited once, accepting my invitation for tea, but her responses were so measured and rehearsed that I felt I was speaking to someone who had prepared for an examination rather than a neighborly chat." Martha's journal continues. "Most curious is their home. From the outside all appears normal, yet not once have I seen any windows opened despite the dreadful summer heat. The curtains remained drawn at all hours. Samuel insists this is merely the habit of city folk, but I have known many families from back east, and none maintain such rigid privacy." Another entry, dated June 10, 1883, reads, "Observed Mrs. Brown in her garden today. She tends to those plants with such methodical precision, each movement deliberate, almost mechanical. When I called out a greeting, she turned to acknowledge me with a delay that seemed just a moment too long, as though she needed to remember how to respond. The garden itself is peculiar, arranged in perfect geometric patterns rather than the practical rows most housewives prefer, and containing herbs I do not recognize." Martha's journal also records an unusual encounter with William Brown in late June. "Met the brother William on the road today. He was measuring distances between certain trees with a strange brass instrument I've never seen before. When he noticed me, he quickly concealed the device and greeted me politely, but seemed eager to end our conversation. I inquired about his writing project, and he mentioned something about documenting spatial anomalies in frontier architecture before excusing himself. His gaze never met mine directly. It seemed to focus on something just behind me, though there was nothing there when I turned to look." The Browns established a pattern that became familiar to those who observed them. Thomas would leave the house precisely at 8 o'clock each morning, walking to town rather than using the horse and buggy they kept in their small stable. Eleanor would occasionally be seen tending to a modest garden at the eastern side of the house, always wearing gloves and a wide-brimmed hat, regardless of the temperature. William's movements were less predictable, but he was often observed returning to the house after extended absences, carrying parcels wrapped in brown paper. A curious incident occurred in late June that was noted by several townspeople. During a violent thunderstorm, when most residents had taken shelter, Thomas Brown was observed standing motionless in the middle of Pine Street, face upturned to the rain, arms slightly extended at his sides. According to Jacob Wilson, the blacksmith whose shop offered a clear view of the street, he just stood there while lightning flashed all around him. Didn't flinch, didn't seek cover. Strangest thing was, when I called out to him, offering shelter in my shop, he turned toward me with this expression, can't properly describe it, like he was struggling to understand what I was or why I'd spoken. Then he walked away, straight back through the downpour, as if it wasn't even touching him. Church records from the period indicate that despite being invited multiple times by Reverend Howard of the First Methodist Church, the Browns never attended Sunday services. This was unusual in a community where church attendance was not merely a religious obligation, but a social cornerstone. The Reverend noted in his personal records, later donated to the church archives, called upon the Brown household to extend Christian welcome. Mr. Brown received me politely but firmly declined my invitation to worship, stating that the family practiced their devotions privately. Something in his manner discouraged further inquiry. The Reverend added a personal observation. While speaking with Mr. Brown at his threshold, I became aware of an unusual acoustical property of the house. Voices, what I presume to be Mrs. Brown and the brother conversing somewhere inside, seemed to emanate not from any specific direction, but rather to surround me, as though the speakers were positioned in a circle with myself at the center. When I commented on this peculiar effect, Mr. Brown abruptly bid me good day and closed the door. What happened within the walls of the Brown residence remained largely unknown to the townspeople of Abilene. However, several accounts mention sounds heard by those who passed by the property at night. Samuel Johnson noted in a statement given years later to the Abilene Star newspaper, "Sometimes, when returning late from town meetings, I would pass their property and hear what sounded like furniture being moved across wooden floors, heavy objects, always after midnight." A cattle driver named Emmett Walsh, whose regular route took him past the Brown property in the early morning hours, reported similar experiences. In a letter to his sister in Dallas, discovered among family papers donated to the Texas Historical Society in 1954, Walsh wrote, "The strangest thing about that house on Pine Street is that you'll hear voices when you know there can't be anyone outside at that hour, not conversation exactly, but something like chanting or recitation. Made my skin crawl to hear it, and the horses didn't like passing there either. They'd always get skittish right around that property, even when the house was dark and still." Walsh's letter continues with an observation that adds another layer to the mystery. "One morning, just before dawn in early July, I saw what looked like all three of them, Mr. Brown, his wife, and his brother, standing in their front yard, positioned in a triangle, facing outward. They weren't moving or speaking, just standing there in the gray light. I called out a greeting, thinking they were up early for some household task, but none of them responded or even turned to look at me. As I continued down the road, I glanced back, and I swear they had changed positions without me seeing them move, now arranged in a straight line, still facing outward. Made the hair on my neck stand up." The local physician, Dr. James Henderson, recorded in his ledger a single visit to the Brown household in July of 1883. The entry is frustratingly vague, stating only, "Called to Brown residents regarding Mrs. Brown's condition, prescribed rest and tincture of valerian, unusual home atmosphere, declined payment." No further details were provided, and Dr. Henderson never publicly discussed the nature of Eleanor's ailment. However, Dr. Henderson's private correspondence, discovered among his effects after his death in 1905, includes a letter to a medical colleague in Houston that contains a cryptic reference. "Have encountered a case that defies conventional diagnosis. Patient exhibits no fever, pain, or physical symptoms, yet appears to be undergoing a profound alteration of personality and perception. Husband reports that she frequently addresses empty rooms as though conversing with unseen presences, and at times seems to respond to his statements before he has spoken them aloud. Have recommended removal to a different environment, but suggestion was not well received. The letter continues with an observation that Dr. Henderson found particularly disturbing. While examining the patient, I experienced a most unusual phenomenon. As she spoke, I could have sworn I heard an echo of her voice emanating from elsewhere in the room, not a true echo, as it sometimes preceded rather than followed her actual speech. When I commented on this, her husband exchanged a look with his brother that I can only describe as significant. The patient herself smiled in a manner I found inexplicably unsettling and said, "The house speaks with us now. Soon we will speak with one voice." I completed my examination as expeditiously as possible and have since found myself reluctant to return, despite professional obligation. August brought a heat wave that affected much of central Texas, with temperatures in Abilene reaching record highs. During this period, activity at the Brown household seemed to decrease further. Curtains remained drawn, and Thomas was observed making only essential trips into town. Eleanor was not seen at all, and William's dusk-time wanderings ceased entirely. Martha Johnson's journal expresses concern. Have not glimpsed Mrs. Brown for nearly 3 weeks now. When I inquired after her health to Mr. Brown, whom I encountered at Parker's store, he assured me she was adapting well, but needed seclusion. His choice of words struck me as peculiar, not recovering or resting, but adapting, as though her condition were some kind of transition rather than illness. A curious incident occurred in late August that was witnessed by both Samuel Johnson and Jacob Wilson, the blacksmith. According to their accounts, they were returning from a town meeting after dark when they observed lights in the Brown house behaving in an unusual manner. Samuel described lights moving from room to room in perfect synchronization, as though multiple persons were walking through the house, carrying lamps and moving in precise coordination. Jacob added the detail that the lights seemed to pass through walls where no doors existed, maintaining their steady movement throughout the structure without interruption. Neither man mentioned this observation to Thomas Brown, but Samuel noted in a private letter to his brother in Houston, "Something unnatural is occurring at the Brown residence. I find myself avoiding their property when possible and have instructed Martha to do the same. There is a growing sense in town that the Browns are not merely eccentric, but somehow unwholesome. Even the children now cross to the opposite side of the street when passing their house." September brought cooler temperatures, but no increase in visible activity from the Browns. Thomas continued his methodical trips to town, though several shopkeepers noted changes in his appearance and demeanor. Herbert Parker's records mention that Mr. Brown appears to have lost considerable weight since his arrival in spring, and his complexion has taken on a grayish cast that suggests illness. Most striking is the change in his eyes. They seem somehow larger, with the iris expanded so that little white is visible. The town librarian, Miss Abigail Winters, recorded in her log that Thomas Brown visited on September 12th to inquire about books on theoretical architecture and non-conventional geometries. Finding nothing suitable in the small library's collection, he seemed disappointed, but thanked her with what she described as perfect courtesy that nonetheless made me shudder. His voice had a quality as though multiple tones were being produced simultaneously. The turning point in this obscure historical account came on October 17, 1883, approximately 6 months after the Browns' arrival in Abilene. According to sheriff's records, Thomas Brown appeared at the office of Sheriff Robert Mills shortly after dawn, requesting assistance at his home. When questioned by the sheriff about the nature of the emergency, Thomas reportedly said only, "My wife and brother are gone. There are circumstances you should witness." The weather that morning, according to meteorological records kept by the railway station, was unusually cold for October, with a dense fog that had settled over the town and surrounding countryside. Several witnesses described Thomas Brown's appearance as he walked through town to the sheriff's office. Hatless, his clothes in disarray, with an expression that, as one observer put it, belonged to a man who had seen something his mind couldn't properly contain. Most disturbing was the account given by Edward Collins, the telegraph operator, who was opening the office as Brown passed. Collins later told the Abilene Star, "His movements were all wrong, jerky one moment, then unnaturally fluid the next. And he was talking to himself, but not like a normal man muttering. It was more like he was having a conversation with himself, his voice changing in pitch and tone as though different people were speaking through him. When he saw me watching, he stopped dead and stared at me with all expression draining from his face. Then he smiled in a way that made me immediately look away, and when I found the courage to look back, he was continuing toward the sheriff's office as though nothing had happened." Sheriff Mills, accompanied by his deputy, Frank Cooper, rode out to the Brown residence immediately. What they found has been documented in official records, but described in frustratingly minimal detail. The sheriff's report, preserved in county archives, states, "Upon arrival at the Brown property, we were escorted inside by Mr. Thomas Brown. The interior of the home was in a state of disarray, with furniture overturned in the parlor and dining room. Of particular note was a section of wallpaper in the upstairs hallway that had been torn away, revealing a sealed doorway that, according to Mr. Brown, he had not previously known existed." The report continues. Mr. Brown claimed to have no knowledge of his wife's or brother's whereabouts. He stated that he had returned from a business trip to Fort Worth the previous evening to find the house in its current condition and the other occupants missing. A thorough search of the property revealed no immediate signs of violence or struggle beyond the displaced furnishings. Deputy Cooper's official statement, filed as an addendum to the sheriff's report, adds a detail that Sheriff Mills omitted. The walls of the parlor appeared to have been written upon, though the writing had been largely obscured by someone attempting to wash it away. What remained visible was not in any language I recognized, consisting of unusual symbols and figures arranged in circular patterns. Cooper's statement continues, "The house itself felt wrong in ways difficult to articulate. Rooms that appeared modest in size from the exterior seemed larger once inside. Sounds did not travel as expected. Voices from adjacent rooms seemed distant, while noises from the far side of the house could be heard with unnatural clarity. Most disturbing was the persistent sensation of being observed from multiple vantage points simultaneously, though no other persons were present. What makes this case particularly unsettling is what happened next. According to multiple sources, including Deputy Cooper's personal correspondence discovered decades later, the sealed doorway in the upstairs hallway was opened in the presence of Sheriff Mills, Deputy Cooper, and Thomas Brown. What they found behind it was a small room, approximately 8 feet square, that contained nothing but a single wooden chair facing the corner and dozens of pages of writing affixed to the walls. The content of these pages has never been fully disclosed in any official capacity. Deputy Cooper's letters to his brother in El Paso, however, mentioned that the writing appeared to be in William Brown's hand and contained what he described as accounts of observations that were of such a disturbing nature that the sheriff deemed it necessary to remove them from the premises immediately. One fragment of these writings, preserved in Cooper's correspondence, reads, "The sounds emanate not from any specific location, but seem to exist simultaneously at multiple points in space. E has begun to hear them as well. She describes them as voices speaking in unison, just below the threshold of comprehension. T denies perception of any unusual phenomena, but I have observed him responding to unheard stimuli when he believes himself unobserved." Another fragment describes a more troubling development. E's condition progresses rapidly. The symmetrical markings on her skin now cover approximately 40% of her body, concentrated along the spine and spreading outward in patterns that bear unsettling similarity to the architectural modifications T has been implementing throughout the house. When asked about these markings, She insists they are not on her skin, but rather visible through it, revealing something underneath that is becoming aligned with the proper structure. Thomas Brown, when questioned about the hidden room, reportedly exhibited genuine shock and insisted he had no knowledge of its existence, despite having lived in the house for half a year. According to Martha Johnson's journal, Thomas claimed, "This house has played tricks on us from the beginning. Rooms that feel larger from the inside than they appear from without. Sounds that travel in impossible ways. Eleanor has complained of voices since our arrival." When pressed further about the missing Eleanor and William, Thomas became increasingly agitated. Sheriff Mills's report notes, Mr. Brown's explanation of events became progressively less coherent. He alternated between claiming that his wife and brother had abandoned him without warning and suggesting that they might still be present in the house in some form he could not properly explain. At one point he stated, "They haven't gone anywhere. They're here. They're all around us. They've just changed how they exist." Sheriff Mills organized a search party consisting of several local men, including Samuel Johnson, to comb the surrounding area for any sign of the missing Eleanor and William Brown. According to official reports, this search yielded no results. However, Samuel Johnson later confided to his wife, as recorded in her journal, "We found something in the dry creek bed about half a mile behind the Brown property. A woman's shawl similar to one I had seen Mrs. Brown wearing snagged on a branch. But when I brought it to the sheriff's attention, he took it from me, examined it briefly, and then stuffed it into his saddlebag without recording it as evidence." When I asked him about this later, he claimed not to remember the incident at all. The investigation into the disappearance of Eleanor and William Brown continued for several weeks, but yielded little concrete evidence. No trace of either missing person was ever officially found. Thomas remained in the house during this period, though Martha Johnson's journal notes that lights could be seen moving from room to room at all hours of the night, and Thomas was observed making multiple trips to the stable, carrying what appeared to be heavy bundles. "There is something different about Mr. Brown since his wife and brother vanished," Martha wrote on November 2, 1883. "His movements are stiffer, his speech patterns altered. Samuel says I'm imagining things, but when Mr. Brown came to borrow our shovel yesterday, he stood in our doorway in a way that made my blood run cold, perfectly still, head slightly tilted, eyes never blinking. When he spoke, the words seemed to come slightly before his lips moved, as though imperfectly synchronized." A particularly disturbing entry from November 10th reads, "Samuel insists I am becoming obsessed with the Browns and their strange house, but I cannot help myself. Today I observed Mr. Brown from our upstairs window as he worked in his yard. He was digging a hole near the stable, and as he worked I could have sworn I saw something else moving with him, like a shadow that didn't quite match his actions, performing the same task slightly out of alignment with his movements. When he finished and turned to walk back to the house, the shadow movement continued digging for several seconds before following him. I have not told Samuel this observation, as he already worries for my nerves." On November 23, 1883, approximately 1 month after reporting his wife and brother missing, Thomas Brown himself disappeared. The circumstances of his departure were as mysterious as those surrounding the earlier vanishings. According to Sheriff Mills' final report on the matter, dated December 7, 1883, the Brown residence was found completely empty of personal belongings. Furniture remained, but clothing, papers, and personal effects had been removed. The only item of note left behind was a leather-bound book discovered in the hidden room, which the sheriff described simply as a ledger of transactions, without further elaboration. The ledger itself was apparently placed in the county records, but disappeared sometime before 1900. Cummings noted in his research journal, "The missing ledger seems to have become something of a taboo subject among the older clerks, who change the topic whenever I inquire too persistently about its contents or whereabouts." One clerk, who requested anonymity, eventually told Cummings that the ledger had contained accounts of exchanges that could not have occurred. and that Sheriff Mills had specifically instructed that it be stored separately from other records and not be made available for public examination. A clerk's notation from 1892 mentions its presence in the archive, but by the time historian Edward Cummings attempted to locate it in 1903, it could not be found. When pressed for further details, the clerk would say only, "It wasn't a record of business transactions, at least not in the usual sense. It documented exchanges of a different nature, things that should not be possible to give or take." The departure of Thomas Brown marked the end of the family's known presence in Abilene, but not the end of the story. In the weeks following his disappearance, several townspeople reported unusual encounters that they associated with the Brown case. Jacob Wilson, the blacksmith, claimed to have seen Thomas walking along the railroad tracks at dusk, heading west out of town. When Wilson called out to him, the figure turned, revealing a face that Wilson described as like Brown's, but not entirely, as though someone else were wearing his features imperfectly. Before Wilson could approach closer, the figure continued walking and was lost to sight in the gathering darkness. Herbert Parker reported a strange customer who entered his store in early December, a woman he initially did not recognize, but who seemed familiar with the layout of his shop and addressed him by name. "It was only after she left that I realized why she had seemed familiar," Parker later told Sheriff Mills. "She moved and spoke exactly like Mrs. Brown, though her appearance was entirely different, and she purchased exactly the same unusual items that Mr. Brown had regularly bought. When I mentioned this similarity, she smiled in a way that made me instinctively step back, and then she left without completing her purchase." The Brown case might have faded entirely from local memory were it not for a series of discoveries made in the decades that followed. In 1901, during excavation for a new well on what had once been the Brown property, the house having been demolished in 1892 after standing vacant for years, workers discovered a collection of personal effects buried approximately 6 feet below the surface near where the stable had stood. These items included women's jewelry consistent with the period, several books with William Brown's name inscribed on the flyleaves, and most disturbingly, a collection of human teeth that were never conclusively identified. The foreman of the excavation, John Mercer, provided a statement to the then sheriff that was recorded in county records. The items were contained in a wooden box that had partially rotted away. The arrangement of objects struck me as deliberate. The jewelry laid out in a circular pattern around the books, which were stacked in a precise manner. The teeth were contained in a small glass vial at the center. There was no indication of human remains beyond the teeth themselves. Mercer later admitted to a local newspaper reporter that he had not disclosed everything in his official statement. There was something else in that box, a small mechanical device unlike anything I'd ever seen. It resembled a pocket watch in size, but instead of telling time, it contained nested brass rings that rotated around each other, with markings I couldn't decipher. The strangest thing was that the rings were moving when we found it, though there was no obvious mechanism to power them. I kept that item thinking it valuable. But 3 days later, it had disappeared from my locked desk drawer, and the same night I dreamed of the Browns standing at the foot of my bed, speaking in unison in a language I didn't understand, but somehow still comprehended. The next morning, I found a perfect circle of small stones on my doorstep. I moved my family to Fort Worth the following week and have never returned to Abilene. The jewelry was claimed by the property's new owner under salvage rights, while the books were donated to the county library. Library records indicate that the books were primarily scientific texts dealing with acoustics, architecture, and something called non-Euclidean geometry. A librarian's note from 1902 states that the books were removed from circulation due to extensive marginalia of a disturbing nature and placed in storage. They were apparently lost when the library suffered water damage from a burst pipe in 1917. However, one page from these books survived, having been removed by a library patron before the books were withdrawn from circulation. This page, which surfaced in a private collection in 1953, contained a diagram of what appeared to be the Brown house, but with architectural modifications that would have been physically impossible to implement. Annotations in what experts confirmed was William Brown's handwriting referred to resonance points and threshold spaces, and included the disturbing note, "Where walls meet at these precise angles, something opens. Not a door in the conventional sense, but a point of potential transition." T has identified 7 such points in the house and has begun modifications to activate them. I fear what may emerge if he succeeds. The case took another turn in 1928 when a man claiming to be Thomas Brown's son appeared in Abilene, seeking information about his father. According to an article in the Abilene Star dated June 12, 1928, the man, who identified himself as James Brown, stated that he had been raised by relatives in Pennsylvania and had only recently learned of his parents' existence. He claimed to have letters written by his father from Abilene, but dated after Thomas Brown's disappearance from the town. Local authorities could neither confirm nor deny the man's identity, and after several days of inquiries, he left Abilene without further comment. Olivia Winters, a hotel clerk who interacted with the supposed James Brown during his stay, later gave a statement to local historian Frank Porter. There was something odd about his appearance. It wasn't any specific feature, but rather the way his features seemed to shift subtly depending on the angle and lighting. Sometimes he looked strikingly like the description I'd heard of Thomas Brown. Then, a moment later, the resemblance would vanish. His manner of speaking was similarly inconsistent, as though he were performing a role he hadn't quite mastered. Winters added a detail that Porter found particularly unsettling. He never seemed to sleep. I worked the night desk, and no matter what hour I looked at the hotel register, his key would be in his box, indicating he was out. Yet during the day, he appeared perfectly alert. When I casually mentioned this to him, wondering if he was having trouble sleeping in an unfamiliar place, he smiled and said, "Sleep is just one way to restore oneself. There are others." Something in his tone made me deeply uncomfortable, and I avoided speaking to him again during his stay. During his time in Abilene, the man who called himself James Brown visited several locations connected to his purported parents, including the former site of the Brown house and the county courthouse, where records of the case were stored. The courthouse clerk on duty during his visit later reported that Brown had requested access to Sheriff Mills's original reports and seemed disappointed when told that some documents, including the mysterious ledger, were no longer available. Before leaving town, Brown left a sealed envelope with the clerk, asking that it be added to the county archives relating to his family. This envelope remained unopened until 1947, when it was examined during a reorganization of the archives. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing the cryptic message, "They are not gone, they are here. I am here. We are here." The transition continues. Those with eyes to see will recognize us. The handwriting was analyzed in 1962 by a forensic expert who concluded that it matched samples of Thomas Brown's writing from 1883, despite having supposedly been written 45 years later. Perhaps the most unsettling development in this historical mystery came in 1962, when historian Margaret Wilson, researching a book on frontier Texas, discovered a collection of documents in the archives of a small historical society in western Pennsylvania. Among these papers was a series of letters apparently written by William Brown and addressed to an unnamed colleague. The letters, dated between February and September of 1883, described William's growing concern about his brother Thomas's behavior and mental state. In one letter dated April 1883, William wrote, "We have relocated to T at my brother's insistence. The house he has purchased unsettles me deeply. My room adjoins what should, by all architectural logic, be an exterior wall, yet at night I hear movement beyond it." When I mentioned this to T, he became agitated and insisted I was mistaken. Eleanor grows more withdrawn by the day. I fear this place was chosen, not despite its peculiarities, but because of them. A later letter, dated June 1883, contains further disquieting observations, have taken to measuring the dimensions of the house at regular intervals. The results defy explanation. The internal measurements exceed the external by a margin that fluctuates daily. When I brought this to T's attention, he smiled in a way I had never seen before and said, "The house is adapting. Soon it will be ready." Ready for what? He would not say. In a letter from July 1883, William's concern deepens. E's behavior grows increasingly erratic. She speaks of the others who live in the walls and claims they are teaching her a new way to exist. T encourages these delusions rather than seeking proper medical attention for her. I have considered reaching out to authorities, but fear doing so would only accelerate whatever process is underway here. A particularly disturbing passage from an August letter reads, "Last night I observed T and E standing in the upstairs hallway, facing the wall where I have suspected a hidden space exists. They were speaking in unison, not in English or any language I recognize, their voices perfectly synchronized in tone and cadence. I remained concealed in the shadows of the stairwell, watching as they pressed their palms against the wall, which seemed to yield slightly to their touch, though it is solid plaster and lath. Most alarming was that from my vantage point I could see both their faces in profile, and neither was blinking or, indeed, appearing to breathe during this recitation, which continued for approximately 7 minutes. A final letter, dated September 1883, contains an even more disturbing passage. I have discovered what T has been doing in the hours before dawn. The modifications to the house are extensive and hidden with remarkable skill. When confronted, he spoke of necessary preparations and joining what was separated. Eleanor knows more than she admits. I have seen her standing motionless in the hallway, listening to something inaudible to normal senses. I am documenting everything should something happen." This was the last known letter written by William Brown. The collection contained no correspondence from after this date, leaving the ultimate fate of the Brown family a matter of speculation. The Historical Society in Pennsylvania had no record of how or when these letters came into their possession, adding yet another layer of mystery to the case. Of particular interest to researchers was a notation in the catalog indicating that the letters had been donated by a woman named Elizabeth Thornfield in 1937. Attempts to trace Ms. Sewon-Sose Thornfield proved unsuccessful, but a marginal note in the Society's accession book, discovered by Wilson, stated, "Donor claimed to be distant relation of Brown family. Appeared elderly, though moved with surprising agility. Left additional materials to be opened only after her death. No record of death found." The additional materials referenced in this note could not be located by Wilson or subsequent researchers. The archivist employed by the Historical Society in 1962, when interviewed, had no knowledge of such items and suggested they might have been removed from the collection at some point prior to his tenure. Wilson's investigation took an unexpected turn when she discovered that Elizabeth Thornfield had stayed at a local boarding house for 3 weeks in 1937 while arranging the donation of the letters. The boarding house's register, preserved by the Historical Society, included a notation beside Thornfield's name. Requested room 7, specifically, spoke of its favorable angles. Kept to herself but often heard talking in room when alone. Departed without notice, leaving key on desk and rent paid through end of month. A photograph included in the boarding house's guest album from that period showed a group of residents gathered for a social evening. A notation identified Elizabeth Thornfield among them, but the woman's face was oddly blurred as though she had moved during the camera's exposure, despite the rest of the image being clear. The few physical descriptions of Thornfield gleaned from the boarding house owner's diary mentioned unusual eyes and a way of tilting her head when listening that reminded one of a bird considering something potentially dangerous. The Brown house no longer stands, having been replaced by other structures as Abilene grew. The exact location corresponds to what is now the intersection of North 6th and Pine Streets. Local residents reported unusual occurrences at properties built on or near the site well into the 1940s, though such accounts diminished as the original layout of the town changed with modernization. James Thornton, who owned a hardware store built on part of the former Brown property from 1923 to 1946, reported in a 1939 interview with the Abilene Star, "The building has its quirks. Inventory goes missing, then reappears days later in places we've already searched." Customers sometimes comment on hearing conversations from empty rooms. Most peculiar is the southeast corner of the storeroom. Tools left there overnight are often found arranged in circular patterns by morning, though the building is securely locked. Thornton elaborated on these experiences in a private memoir, discovered among his effects after his death in 1952. There are certain spots in the building where sound behaves strangely. Whispers become clearly audible, while normal conversation seems muffled. Most disturbing are the occasions when I've been alone in the store after hours and heard my own voice coming from another room, speaking words I had thought but not uttered aloud. I have taken to conducting business exclusively during daylight hours and never remain alone in the building after sunset. Another business that occupied part of the former Brown property was a small photographic studio operated by Vincent Hayes from 1929 to 1937. Hayes abandoned the location after a series of inexplicable technical issues that he detailed in correspondence with the Eastman Kodak Company, seeking explanations for what he was experiencing. In one letter, Hayes wrote, "Photographs taken in certain areas of the studio show consistent anomalies, not standard exposure issues or development errors, but rather what appear to be additional figures in the background that were not present during the sitting. These figures are indistinct but distinctly humanoid, and their positions shift slightly in sequential exposures, suggesting movement. Most troubling is that they appear only in photographs taken in the northwest corner of the building, regardless of camera, film stock, or lighting conditions." Hayes closed his studio after an incident he described in his final letter to Kodak. "Yesterday, while developing a portrait taken in the problematic corner, I observed something that has convinced me to abandon these premises immediately. As the image formed in the development tray, I saw not only the expected subject, Mrs. Harriet Simmons, but standing behind her, 3 figures arranged in a triangle. As I watched, horrified, the chemical process seemed to accelerate specifically around these figures, their features resolving before the rest of the image. For a brief moment, I could clearly see their faces, which all bore the same expression, despite being different individuals. Mrs. Simmons has no family in Abilene and had come to the sitting alone. I destroyed the negative and all prints and have already begun relocating my equipment to new premises. What happened to the Brown family remains one of the most perplexing unsolved mysteries in Abilene's history. Were the disappearances the result of foul play? Did Thomas Brown have some connection to the strange, hidden room that predated his purchase of the house? The official investigation concluded with more questions than answers, and the passage of time has only deepened the mystery. In 1967, during the demolition of the old county courthouse, a sealed metal box was discovered within a cornerstone. Inside was a collection of items that Sheriff Mills had apparently hidden away, including several pages of the writings found in the hidden room of the Brown house. These fragments, analyzed by linguistics professor Daniel Roberts of Texas Tech University, were described as the systematic documentation of auditory phenomena experienced within the house, recorded with scientific precision, but describing events that defy rational explanation. Professor Roberts noted in his report, which was never formally published but exists in the university archives, the writer, presumably William Brown, describes with increasing distress the sounds of movement within walls where no space should exist, voices engaged in conversation when no one else was present in the house, and, most disturbingly, what he termed the gradual harmonization of separate identities. as the phenomena progressed. One fragment reproduced in Roberts's report reads, "The voices no longer maintain distinct identities, but speak in perfect unison. When they do so, the physical space around the sound source appears to distort visibly, as though the air itself becomes briefly malleable." T has begun standing before mirrors for hours, whispering to his reflection in what sounds like multiple voices speaking simultaneously. I fear he is not merely observing the phenomenon, but actively facilitating it. Another fragment contains an even more disturbing observation. E claimed this morning that she had seen through the walls and that what lies beyond is not empty space, but a different arrangement of the same elements. When pressed to explain, she described a place where identity is fluid rather than fixed, and where separation is recognized as illusion. Her vocabulary has altered dramatically, incorporating terms I have never heard her use before, many of which appear to be neologisms created to describe concepts for which no existing words suffice. Professor Roberts's analysis included a disturbing personal note. After spending several weeks with these documents, I have begun experiencing auditory phenomena similar to those described by William Brown. Specifically, I sometimes perceive my own voice as slightly preceding my conscious formation of words, as though my speech were being anticipated by some external agency. I have requested a leave of absence from my teaching duties and intend to discontinue this research permanently. The box of documents discovered in the courthouse cornerstone also contained a personal journal kept by Sheriff Mills, which had never been made part of the official record. In it, Mills detailed aspects of the Brown case that he had deliberately omitted from his official reports, apparently out of concern for public reaction. One entry, dated October 18, 1883, the day after his initial visit to the Brown house, reads, "What we found in the root cellar defies rational explanation and should not be included in any public documentation. The modifications to the space are extensive and clearly required significant time and expertise to implement, yet Brown denies any knowledge of them. The geometric patterns inscribed on the floor and walls form a precise configuration that Deputy Cooper recognized from his military service as resembling survey markers, though serving no obvious practical purpose in this context." A later entry, dated November 3, 1883, details Mill's growing concern about Thomas Brown's behavior following the disappearance of his wife and brother. Brown appears increasingly disassociated from normal human behavior. His speech patterns have altered noticeably. He now speaks as though reciting prepared statements rather than engaging in spontaneous conversation. Most troubling is his insistence that Eleanor and William are still present, despite all evidence to the contrary. When pressed on this point today, he stated, "They have not departed, but transformed. The boundaries between us have dissolved. We continue together in a more efficient configuration. I find myself reluctant to be alone in his presence, and have instructed Cooper to accompany me on all future visits to the property." The final entry regarding the Browns, dated November 24, 1883, recounts Mills's discovery of Thomas's disappearance. "The house stands empty, yet I cannot shake the sensation that it remains occupied. While examining the hidden room, I experienced a moment of disorientation, during which I distinctly heard three voices speaking in perfect unison from immediately behind me, though when I turned, no one was present. The words were clear, 'We see you, seeing us,' yet seemed to bypass my ears and manifest directly in my mind. I have ordered the house sealed until further notice, and will recommend its demolition at the earliest opportunity." The Brown case has inspired numerous theories over the decades. Some suggest that Thomas Brown, possibly suffering from an undiagnosed mental condition, may have been responsible for the disappearance of his wife and brother. Others point to the strange characteristics of the house itself, proposing that some architectural anomaly or environmental factor might have contributed to shared delusions among the occupants. A few local historians have even suggested connections to other mysterious disappearances reported in the region during the same period, though evidence for such connections remains tenuous at best. Folklorist Raymond Carter, who studied the case in the 1970s, noted similarities between the Brown mystery and older frontier legends. Throughout American history, we find accounts of houses that turn against their occupants or spaces that seem to exist outside normal physical laws. The Brown case contains elements of these folk narratives, but is distinguished by the unusual amount of contemporary documentation suggesting a factual basis underlying what might otherwise be dismissed as mere legend. Carter's research uncovered a curious pattern. Several families who occupied homes built by Conrad Schmidt, the contractor who had constructed the original Miller House, reported experiencing unusual acoustic phenomena and spatial disorientation. Schmidt himself had emigrated from Bavaria and was known to incorporate elements of European architectural traditions unfamiliar to Texas at that time. According to Carter, Schmidt's designs often featured unusual angles and proportions that, while not immediately obvious to casual observation, created subtle effects on perception and sound transmission. Whether these elements were intentional or the result of idiosyncratic methods remains unclear, as Schmidt left no writings explaining his architectural philosophy before his death in 1879. Martha Johnson's journal provides one final chilling entry regarding the Browns, dated December 1883, after Thomas had also vanished. Samuel insists we never speak of the Browns again. He returned from helping with the final search of their property with such a pallor that I feared for his health. When pressed, he would say only that he had seen something in the root cellar that changed his understanding of what is possible. He made me promise never to enter that property, a promise I intend to keep. 2 weeks later, she added, Samuel is not himself since that day at the Brown house. He stands for hours looking out our window toward their property. This morning I found him in our yard before dawn, measuring distances between our trees with precise steps, much as I had once observed William Brown doing. When I called to him, he turned with a delay that reminded me terribly of Eleanor Brown's mannerisms. He claimed to have been sleepwalking and remembered nothing of his actions, but I saw something in his eyes that filled me with dread, a sense of something looking at me that was not entirely my husband. The root cellar Samuel Johnson referenced was apparently filled in with soil and stones shortly thereafter, according to town records, which note a permit granted for modifications to existing structure at the Brown property in January 1884, after it had been formally abandoned. The contents of the root cellar remain a subject of speculation. Sheriff Mills's official report made no mention of anything unusual found there, but his deputy Frank Cooper, in a personal letter dated January 1884, wrote, I will not commit to paper the full extent of what we discovered beneath that house. The sheriff has ordered all documentation destroyed and the site sealed. I find myself waking at night thinking I can hear a sound like what we heard coming from behind that wall, a sound like multiple voices speaking in perfect unison, forming words in no language I recognize, but which nonetheless seem almost comprehensible, as though the meaning hovers just beyond the threshold of understanding. The letter continues with a disturbing confession. I have not told Mills, but twice now I have found myself standing before mirrors, observing my reflection as it moves slightly out of synchronization with me, as though it were a separate entity, merely approximating my actions. After the second occurrence, I took down all mirrors in my home and have avoided reflective surfaces since. I dream often of the Brown house, but in these dreams, its dimensions are vastly larger inside than out, containing endless corridors arranged in geometric patterns that seem to fold back upon themselves. I wake from these dreams feeling that some part of me has remained in that impossible architecture. Cooper resigned his position as deputy in March 1884 and relocated to Arizona Territory. His subsequent correspondence makes no further mention of the Brown case, though a cousin who visited him in 1892 noted in a family letter that Frank maintains an unusual household, no mirrors, no photographs, and every room arranged with furniture positioned at precise angles that he insists must not be disturbed. He speaks little of his time in Abilene and changes the subject immediately if the town is mentioned. In 1965, a graduate student in psychology named Robert Carter became interested in the Brown case while researching the effects of isolation on family units. Carter traveled to Abilene and spent several weeks reviewing available records and interviewing elderly residents who had grown up hearing stories about the mysterious family. His unpublished thesis includes a curious footnote. Multiple independent sources described Thomas Brown as having an unusual manner of speaking, specifically that he would sometimes pause mid-sentence as if listening to something, then continue with slightly altered wording as though receiving correction. Carter also noted that descriptions of Thomas Brown from different sources contained subtle but significant inconsistencies. Some described him as tall and gaunt, others as being of average height with a more robust build. His hair is variously described as dark brown, light brown, or even reddish in one account. While memory is notoriously unreliable, particularly over generations, the degree of variation suggests either multiple unreliable narrators or, more unsettlingly, a subject whose appearance was somehow mutable. In the course of his research, Carter attempted to trace the Brown family's origins in Pennsylvania, but found no conclusive evidence of their existence prior to their arrival in Abilene. Marriage records, birth certificates, and property deeds that should have established their history simply could not be located. The few references to a Thomas Brown of appropriate age in Pennsylvania records indicated a man who had died in 1878, 5 years before the Browns' appearance in Texas. Carter's thesis advisor, Dr. Elizabeth Montgomery, added her own observation to the final document. What strikes me about this case is not merely the mysterious circumstances of the disappearances, but the way in which the Brown family seems to have existed in a state of partial separation from normal social structures. They established minimal necessary connections to the community, but maintained a degree of isolation that would be difficult to achieve without deliberate effort. One wonders if this isolation was a cause or a consequence of whatever transpired in that house. Carter's research took an unusual turn when he discovered a small archive of materials related to the Brown case in the possession of a retired librarian named Grace Wilson, who had worked at the Abilene Public Library from 1922 to 1951. Wilson had privately collected newspaper clippings, personal accounts, and other ephemera connected to the case out of personal interest. Among these materials was a letter dated 1893, written by a woman named Sarah Simmons, who had briefly worked as a housemaid for the Browns during the summer of 1883. Simmons's letter, addressed to her sister, contains observations not recorded elsewhere. The house never felt right from the moment I entered it. The layout confused me daily. Rooms seemed to shift in relation to each other, so that what had been a straight path from kitchen to dining room one day would require a turn the next. Mrs. Brown spent hours in her bedroom with the door locked, though I sometimes heard her speaking as though in conversation. Mr. Brown instructed me never to clean certain areas, particularly the root cellar and a section of the upstairs hallway that, to my eye, contained nothing warranting such protection. Most unsettling was the brother, William, who would watch me as I worked, taking notes in a small book. Once I found this book left open and glimpsed a page containing a detailed sketch of me, but with anatomical elements depicted as though I had been dissected, with annotations in a script I could not read. The letter continues, I left their employment after witnessing something I cannot fully explain. I was dusting in the parlor when I observed all three Browns standing in the garden, arranged in a triangle formation. They remained perfectly motionless for nearly 20 minutes, during which time I continued my work while watching them through the window. Then, without any visible movement or transition, they were suddenly arranged in a straight line instead of a triangle, though I had not seen them move to reposition themselves. When they returned inside shortly thereafter, All three paused upon seeing me and tilted their heads in identical fashion, as though examining an unusual specimen. I made an excuse about a family emergency and never returned to the house. The final documented reference to the Brown case comes from an article in the Abilene Historical Quarterly, published in 1968, which mentioned that the sealed doorway discovered in the house apparently led to a space that should not have existed, according to the original architectural plans of the home, which were located in a county archive. The article quoted a structural engineer as saying, based on the dimensions recorded in Sheriff Mills's report and the original house plans, the hidden room occupied space that should have been outside the physical boundaries of the structure. Either the reports were in error, or the house was constructed with a deliberate deception in mind. The engineer who provided this assessment, Howard Matthews, later expanded on his conclusions in a letter to the journal's editor that was never published. I've examined similar architectural anomalies in older structures and typically find simple explanations, measurement errors, undocumented renovations, or deliberate optical illusions created by skilled builders. The Brown house presents a more challenging case. If the measurements in the sheriff's report are accurate, the hidden room occupied what should have been empty space beyond the north wall of the house. This is not merely unlikely, but should be physically impossible. Matthews added a personal note. Since completing my analysis of the Brown house dimensions, I have experienced a recurring dream in which I am inside a house that continuously reconfigures itself around me. Walls fold into ceilings, doorways open onto previously inaccessible spaces, and corridors extend beyond what the exterior dimensions should allow. Most disturbing is that in these dreams, I am simultaneously aware of being both inside and outside the structure, observing my own movements from multiple perspectives simultaneously. I mention this not because I believe it relevant to the structural analysis, but because the intensity and persistence of these dreams have led me to wonder if prolonged contemplation of spatial impossibilities might itself affect perception in unexpected ways. And there the historical record essentially ends. No definitive explanation has ever been established for what happened to Eleanor and William Brown, or to Thomas Brown himself. The few physical artifacts connected to the case have been lost or scattered over time. The writings found in the hidden room, apart from the fragments preserved by Sheriff Mills, have never been recovered. The ledger of transactions mentioned in the final report has similarly vanished from historical record. Occasional references to the Browns appear in personal correspondence and oral histories collected from Abilene residents in the early 20th century, but these add little substantive information. A common theme in these later accounts is the reluctance of those who had direct knowledge of the case to discuss it in detail. As one elderly resident told an interviewer in 1942, "Some things are best left undisturbed, and that house was one of them. The Browns weren't right, and neither was what happened to them." A curious development occurred in 1975 when a visiting architectural student from MIT conducting research on frontier building techniques took a particular interest in the Brown case. After several weeks examining records and the site where the house had stood, the student, Michael Chen, produced a set of detailed drawings reconstructing the probable layout of the Brown house based on all available documentation. Chen's academic advisor reported receiving these drawings by mail, accompanied by a brief note stating that Chen had discovered something significant about the spatial configuration and would be extending his stay in Abilene to investigate further. Chen never returned to MIT, and subsequent inquiries revealed that he had checked out of his hotel in Abilene without leaving a forwarding address. His reconstructed plans of the Brown house were examined by several architects and mathematicians, who noted that the arrangement of rooms, while appearing conventional at first glance, incorporated subtle angular relationships that created what one reviewer called a disturbing sense of spatial dissonance. A mathematics professor who studied the plans wrote, "The overall configuration appears to reference non-Euclidean geometric principles in a way that would be highly unusual for a frontier architect of the 1870s. Most notably, certain proportional relationships between rooms suggest an awareness of concepts in higher dimensional geometry that were only beginning to be explored in academic circles during that period. What remains is a case that defies conventional explanation. A family that arrived with little background inhabited a house that appeared to contain architectural impossibilities and then vanished, leaving behind only fragmented clues and disturbing suggestions. The Brown case stands as a reminder that even in a time when America was being mapped, settled, and documented with increasing thoroughness, pockets of profound mystery could still exist, especially within the confines of an ordinary-seeming house on the edge of a growing frontier town. Those who have studied the case in the years since often note the same curious detail. No photographs of the Brown family have ever been found. In an era when photography was becoming increasingly common, particularly among those of apparent means like the Browns, this absence is itself unusual. We have only written descriptions to tell us what Thomas, Eleanor, and William looked like. Descriptions that, as Robert Carter noted, don't entirely align. Local photographer Edmund Graves, whose studio operated in Abilene from 1875 to 1891, mentioned the Browns in his business records. Brown family declined portraits sitting on 3 separate occasions. Mr. Brown objected specifically to the camera itself, rather than the cost or inconvenience, stating that certain types of documentation were against their principles. Only family, in my experience, to so adamantly refuse photography. A small footnote to the photographic aspect of the case emerged in 1980 when the descendants of Frank Cooper, the deputy who had assisted Sheriff Mills, donated a collection of his personal effects to the Abilene Historical Society. Among these items was a damaged glass plate negative that Cooper had apparently kept hidden among his possessions. A note accompanying the negative, in Cooper's handwriting, read simply, "Brown House, 1883, do not develop." Despite this warning, Historical Society staff had the negative professionally restored and printed. The resulting image showed the exterior of what is presumed to be the Brown House, a conventional 2-story structure with no obvious unusual features. However, the photograph contains a curious anomaly. 3 indistinct figures are visible standing in the front yard, arranged in a triangular formation, their features blurred beyond recognition, despite the rest of the image being relatively clear. Photographic experts who examined the print concluded that the blurring was not the result of movement during exposure, but rather some unknown flaw in the development process that affected only those specific areas of the negative. In 1968, the last known direct connection to the Brown case disappeared when Martha Johnson's granddaughter passed away, taking with her any family stories that hadn't been recorded in writing. The land where the Brown house once stood has changed hands many times in the intervening years. The current structures there, modern commercial buildings, bear no resemblance to what existed in 1883. If the land itself remembers what transpired there, it keeps its secrets well. A curious footnote to the case emerged in 1972 when construction workers excavating for a new building foundation near the original Brown property unearthed a small metal container buried approximately 4 feet below ground level. Inside was a single page of yellowed paper bearing what appeared to be a fragment of William Brown's writing, though this was never conclusively verified. The text, partially legible despite water damage, read, "The boundaries between us are thinning." I catch myself speaking words I did not intend, expressing thoughts that do not seem to originate within my own mind. E reports similar experiences. We find ourselves completing each other's sentences with increasing frequency, sometimes speaking in unison without conscious coordination. T observes these occurrences with what can only be described as satisfaction. The authenticity of this document has been questioned by some researchers who point out that it was not subjected to proper forensic analysis before being misplaced, during transport to a university laboratory. However, handwriting comparison with the known fragments of Williams' writings suggests a potential match. One final tenuous connection to the Brown case surfaced in 1992, when anthropologist Dr. Rebecca Foster, researching folk beliefs in rural Texas communities, recorded an interview with an elderly resident of a small town approximately 40 miles from Abilene. The man, then in his 90s, recounted a story told to him by his grandfather about three strangers who had appeared in their community in the winter of 1883-1884, seeking temporary lodging. According to the account, the three, two men and a woman, spoke and moved with unusual synchronization, as though they shared one mind and insisted on renting a small cabin that stood at a specific point on the property where several property lines converged. They remained for less than a month before departing, without explanation, leaving behind elaborate geometric patterns carved into the cabin's wooden floor and walls. They spoke to him only once directly, asking if he had ever lived in a house that spoke back to you. When he said no, they all three smiled in exactly the same way, at exactly the same moment, and one of them, he could never remember which one, said, "You will." After they left, my grandfather burned the cabin to the ground, despite it being sound structure, and would never speak of why except to say that some spaces, once changed, can never be trusted again. And so we are left with a historical curiosity, a brief moment when something inexplicable touched the otherwise orderly development of a Texas town. The man told Foster, "My grandfather said there was something wrong with their faces, not deformed or ugly, but somehow unfinished looking, as though they were still deciding what features to settle on." The Browns arrived, existed in their peculiar isolation for half a year, and then were gone, leaving behind questions that will likely never be answered. What was the true relationship between the three family members? What was being documented in the hidden room? What did Samuel Johnson see in the root cellar that disturbed him so deeply? And perhaps most fundamentally, who or what were the Browns? As with many historical mysteries, time has obscured more than it has revealed. Documents fade, memories become stories, stories become legends, and the truth recedes beyond recovery. What remains is a case that continues to disturb precisely because it suggests boundaries between spaces, between identities, between what is known and what is merely sensed, maybe more permeable than our ordinary experience would have us believe. The night the Browns disappeared from Abilene in 1883, several residents reported an unusual stillness in the air, as though the natural sounds of the Texas evening had been momentarily suspended. Martha Johnson wrote of watching distant lightning flicker silently beyond the horizon, illuminating the now dark brown house in brief, intermittent flashes. "In those moments of illumination," she wrote, "I could swear the shape of the house was wrong somehow, its angles and proportions subtly altered from what they should have been. By morning all appeared normal again, but I will never forget that temporary transformation, nor what it suggested about the nature of what we perceive as solid and unchanging." Sheriff Mills, who retired from his position in 1885 and rarely spoke of the Brown case thereafter, made one significant exception. In 1891, shortly before his death, he gave a brief statement to a reporter from the Fort Worth Gazette who was researching historical crimes of the region. The reporter's notes, preserved in the newspaper's archives, record Mills as saying, "There are cases where the law as we understand it has no jurisdiction. What happened to the Browns, or what the Browns themselves were, falls into this category. I have kept certain knowledge to myself all these years, not out of negligence of duty, but out of conviction that some truths serve no purpose in being widely known." When pressed for details, Mills reportedly said, "Consider that we recognize each other primarily by physical appearance and patterns of behavior. Then consider what might be possible if those identifying features were somehow negotiable. The Browns didn't go anywhere. They're still here. They're just wearing different faces now. The reporter apparently dismissed these cryptic comments as the ramblings of an elderly man, and they were never included in the published article. Mills died 3 weeks later from what was recorded as natural causes. An odd postscript to Mills' final statement emerged in 1943, when his granddaughter, sorting through family papers, discovered a sealed envelope addressed in Mills' handwriting with instructions that it be opened only after his death. For reasons she could not later explain, she had left the envelope unopened for over 50 years. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing the names of 7 Abilene residents, including Samuel Johnson, who had assisted in the final search of the Brown property. Beside each name was a date, in each case the precise date of that person's death, though the document had been written years or even decades before those deaths occurred. At the bottom of the page was a brief note. They did not disappear. They transformed. They spread. They continue. In time, they will achieve a more efficient configuration. Perhaps that is the most unsettling legacy of the Brown case, the suggestion that what we understand as fixed and reliable, whether architectural spaces or human identities, might under certain circumstances become fluid, malleable, or merged in ways that defy conventional understanding. The mystery of the Brown family and their macabre house remains, after all this time, fundamentally unsolved. In the words of historian Margaret Wilson, who first discovered William Brown's letters, some historical cases resist resolution not because evidence is lacking, but because the evidence that exists points toward conclusions so at odds with our understanding of reality that we have no framework in which to place them. The Brown case is such an instance, a moment when the historical record seems to tear, revealing something underneath that we have neither the vocabulary nor the concepts to adequately describe. Those who delve too deeply into the Brown case often report experiencing subtle but persistent alterations in their perception, unusual acoustic phenomena, spatial disorientation, or most commonly, dreams of houses with impossible geometries. Margaret Wilson herself eventually abandoned her research on the case, citing in private correspondence a growing sense of intellectual contamination, as though prolonged contemplation of these events has begun to reshape my understanding of what is possible in ways I find deeply unsettling. The sound that still echoes from this case across nearly a century and a half is not a scream or a desperate plea, but something more subtle and perhaps more terrifying, the quiet rustle of pages being affixed to walls in a room that shouldn't exist, documenting observations that shouldn't be possible, written by a man who would soon join his companions in an absence that has never been explained.